Oops. I left the clicker somewhere. There it is. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. This was an experiment. The last speaker of a 3-day conference. Either everybody stayed or everybody didn't. But there is a rule in facilitation. The right people are always in the room. So I thank you very much for staying, and I think we're going to have a great time. I am, as the announcers indicated, an academic futurist. I have to tell you that I am actually the accidental futurist because I had absolutely no intention of becoming a futurist deep into my life. And I'll explain that story in just a moment. I'm the living example of you can't predict the future, even your own, because so many things happen along the way. So first of all, let me say that, as they mentioned, I have had a long association and a great association with the University of Houston, which itself is the accidental university of the future, because they created, in a very futuristic time, and those of you who remember the 1970s, lots of talk about the future. Alvin Toffler, limits to growth, lots of turbulence. Arab oil embargo, Watergate, hyperinflation, and that was after the 60s, which itself was a pretty interesting and very turbulent time. I came to the University of Houston in 1976 to teach statistics, but they had already created the year before the very first degree in future studies in the world, studies of the future. I met with the dean before I was interviewed for the position. I was being recruited to teach statistics, and I read the catalog. At the end of our lunch, I said, Dean, I saw this degree called Studies of the Future. What is that? I think I was a little bit edgy. I was a scientific sociologist. You can't study the future. It doesn't exist, right? That was the first. He said, we study the past, don't we? Well, yes, sir. Why can't we study the future? Well, I had a lot of reasons why you couldn't study the future, but I wanted the job. I wanted to move out of southern Georgia into Texas, into Houston, and I kept my mouth shut and got the job, and then started hanging out with these faculty members. I'd actually gotten my degree in sociology to study social change. Kind of grew up in those 60s, those turbulent times of civil rights movements, anti-Vietnam War movement, the beginning of the environmental movement, political assassinations. It was all from about 1965 to 1980 was very turbulent times, and I wanted to understand that. I thought I was going to be a physicist. I wasn't going to do any good, so I did switch to sociology. I found out, however, that although sociology was created with two big divisions by a French philosopher in the 1820s, social statics, how groups are put together, and social dynamics, how they change. Sociology doesn't study social dynamics. Really? If they don't study social dynamics, who's doing that? Well, actually nobody. Because, and the data I have is that if you pick up an introductory textbook in sociology, standard kind of freshman course in sociology at a university, you will see 15 chapters, cleverly titled because there are 15 weeks in the semester. That was, somebody thought ahead on that one. And there, in 2007, you would find that the three of those books didn't have even one chapter on social change. If you picked one up in 2014, oh, progress. Every book had one chapter on social change, exactly one chapter, and in every book it was the last chapter. Come on. You don't get to the last chapter in any textbook in college or in high school. Oh, they said, you're studying for exams. Oh, you can read those on your own and study the rest. So my point is, the only people who are really talking about social change in the world and in society are sociologists and are futurists. And so I was happy to do that. I joined the program in 1983 by teaching, and they said, you got to run the program, you've got to develop the curriculum, do all those things, which I was very happy to do. 30 years later, I retired from that profession. Graduating professional futurists for 30 years, over 400 of them graduated during my time there. Moved on to a retirement that did not include golf, which I hated, or fishing, which to me was an excuse for sitting around drinking beer. So I said, who is not being talked about? Who doesn't talk about the future? I was talking to adult seminars, conferences like this, public speaking, the military intelligence communities, corporations, government agencies. Nobody was talking to young people. So I said, that's what I will do. I will create a social movement to begin the process of inserting futures thinking into schools, into high schools and into colleges. And part of my reason for being here in Warsaw, and we thank the university for inviting me, is to begin and to continue to strengthen. We have hubs throughout the world. There is a hub here in Poland. And to organize and help people develop that. One of my friends is right here in the audience. We're working together on that tomorrow. So this is a movement. I have to tell you, however, having been a college professor for close to 40 years, prepared me not one whit to be a social change agent or an entrepreneur or anything like that. I do what I can, and we're getting some slow progress going. So that's basically how I came to be on this stage today and sharing with you some ideas about the future. So what are the ideas about the future? Gerd Leonard talked about what a futurist is, that a futurist does not predict the future. We know that also, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. But I like these two phrases here. For the anxious, we assure them. We've been here before. Adaptability is possible. We will create change. It won't be perfect. It won't be soon enough. But the anxiety, extreme anxiety, is not really necessary. On the other hand, those people who believe they've got it knocked, they've got it cold, they know exactly what's going to happen, will scare the hell out of them because they don't. So we're trying to build this balance between, yes, there are some things to be worried about, and yes, there are opportunities for change that will help doing that. And so that's our watchword of moving forward. So out of this concept in the 20th century, we've created big field. Lots of people deal with the future. Started in the 1920s and the 30s, and now is econometrics, market research, weather forecasting, demographic forecasting, you name it. Everybody is forecasting the future, and then all the strategic planning that goes on and whatever goes along. There's only one problem. Every time you draw a conclusion to a set of data, you have to make an assumption. And what are the assumptions of traditional forecasting and planning? Here they are. Trends will continue as they have before. The future will be like the past. Nothing surprising or unexpected will occur. How valid is that post-pandemic, post-financial recession, post-wars in Ukraine and Gaza, post you name it, you name it, you name it. Fall of the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. Can we really use those traditional techniques of forecasting and planning and make that assumption as indeed the speed of change is picking up and the amount of disruptions that are appearing to us are becoming more frequent and more serious? Therefore, we need and have developed an additional approach. It's not instead of, but it's in addition to the traditional forecasting and planning techniques. And I'm going to get to the future of education after this. We all learned this approach, obviously practiced by professionals, economists and market research people, but we learned it in school, even though none of us ever took a course on the future in high school or even college, or hardly ever heard the word, the future, because it's a taboo subject in schools. And why is that? Well, we did pick it up, though, from other classes. We picked it up from science class. Science class, the future's predictable. Of course, you know, you predict the period of the pendulum, and you do the experiment, and you change the weights, and you change the lengths, and what do you get? The same results of the same results. You get an A. Biology, chemistry, all of the physical laws do allow for predictability. We can't do that when we first ask the right question, but over time, more data, more theory, more computer simulations, we get closer and closer to the answer. We walk out of there and say, well, why can't we predict the economy? Why can't we predict the election? Why can't we predict how much money a movie will make in the marketplace? Because there's one element that physics does not have in it, and it's called human beings. And I realized that there was a different phenomenon here. It's not that futurists are lazy or ignorant of how to do the traditional techniques. I taught that for 10 years in statistics class. It's that the phenomenon itself is unpredictable. So we left school with the impression that we should be able to predict the future. The second place we picked it up was in history class. History class is one event after the other, and that event had a cause or a set of causes. That event happened, and it had consequences. And those consequences then became the causes of other events. And those consequences became, and on and on and on, rolling out one thing after another. It seemed to be pretty well set. There were some surprises in there. There were some disruptions in there, wars and diseases and new inventions and things like that. But for the most part, and certainly a long time ago, it was fairly straightforward, one step after the other, and we would do that. So we thought, well, we should be able to predict the future. All we got to do is get the causes right and the events right and the consequences right, and we go on and on and on into the future. That was where we left high school, believing that the future was predictable and indeed inevitable. Then we got to college. In college, we came across those crazy professors who couldn't decide or couldn't agree with anybody because they had different assumptions. There were Marxists out there, and there were conservatives out there, and there were religious people out there, and they were all arguing about how things should be. So we were really confused now. Could we predict it or not? Is it determined or not? And then we got to statistics class where we encountered truly random phenomena, true phenomena that actually are impossible to predict what happens. Over the long run, in the aggregate, of course, but not in the individual case. There's a reason why we don't talk about the future in school, because those teachers were students in their day, and they were just as confused and are still confused. Because they don't know how to talk about, they don't know how to teach something where they can't tell students the answer. You can't tell them what's going to happen in the future, so let's just not mention it. And that's one of the problems. The fifth place we picked it up was not so much in class, but we picked up another belief about the future, and that is you can be anything you want to be. Our parents told us this. Our teachers told us this, our ministers, pastors, mentors, peers, whatever. If you work hard enough, you will be that, which is simply not true. You get more of it, yes, but not all of it. Can't guarantee it. So, is the future determined or not? Is it handed to us, or do we actually create it? And so being confused is the reason we don't introduce this to schools. There is a source of the conclusion. There is an answer to the confusion, but it is not generally well known. The field is still very small, and we haven't yet penetrated teacher colleges or teachers themselves or others to say, yes, we should be including that, and that's what Teach the Future is about. So how do we square this circle? How do we do forecasting and planning in an environment that is essentially unpredictable? And this video is one short way, less than 2-minute video, that describes the problem that we have.
We live in a rapidly changing world. Every day brings new innovations, challenges, social issues, and transformations. As the rate of change grows exponentially and multiple crises compound on a global scale, we struggle to keep up. Soon, the gap between what is happening, what's to come, and what we can do about it significantly widens. Bridging that gap in today's increasingly complex landscape can feel like an impossible task, especially for policymakers. But there is a way forward. Strategic foresight is a systematic approach to dealing with uncertainty and thinking about the future to better inform our decision-making and prepare for different outcomes. At UN Global Pulse, we use strategic foresight to explore different futures and identify risks, opportunities, and potential changes that might emerge. Our approach is rooted in empathy and inclusion to foster the exchange of new ideas and diverse points of view, helping to overcome bias and systemic separation and opening minds to unexpected possibilities. Together, we co-create processes, value the network of collaborators, and experiment by embracing uncertainty in our work. The result is a total mind shift, a breakthrough that reveals the interconnected nature of future events and our collective humanity. A system view that catalyzes innovative solutions that become steps towards a shared vision of tomorrow. The world is changing quickly, but with strategic foresight, we can keep the pace. Let's build our common futures together.
So just a short video on this new technique, not so new anymore. People started talking about this in the 1950s. Bertrand de Juvenal in Paris, Herman Kahn and Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California, Rachel Carson, Donella Meadows, Alvin Toffler. These folks were saying this is a real thing now. And the problem is that the old techniques, let's put it that way, are incapable of handling the speed of change, the level of change, and the disruptions that are becoming more frequent and more serious. If we don't throw those away, this is in addition to those, as you'll see here in just a moment. So my friend Rial Miller, who was the futurist at UNESCO for many, many years, I love the phrase that he used. He called it the changing conditions of change. Change itself was changing. That's what we're saying. If you had one technique for dealing with one kind of change that was fairly predictable and fairly determined, then when that changes, you need a different technique or additional techniques. And that's what foresight is. That's what future studies is. So we're moving in that direction. The fundamental concept, then, is this concept. The future is not one, it's many. That's becoming actually common today. It's not a road that has one past, one present, and an ending at a destination. But you listen to people talk about the future, they're asking you or themselves or others to pick. What's the destination? Where will we be in the future? That's the first thing that people ask me. What do you think is going to happen? And I have a specific answer to that in just a moment. Where does the road end? Wrong metaphor. The metaphor is a river and a river delta. A river has one past, yes, within the banks, one present, where we are at the moment, but multiple futures. A log or a canoe or a molecule going down the river does not know which of those branches. It will go through one of them. It's not a quantum phenomenon, it goes through all at the same time and all that stuff. It's a real phenomenon. It will be one future. But trying to figure it out now is not only foolish, it's also harmful. And if you listen to the public discourse these days, it is all about which future will actually occur. If we have multiple futures, we should be allowed, and we are allowed, to think of 2 or 3 futures simultaneously as not right or wrong, but as better and worse. And that's where our education system, I think, the fatal problem of our education system today is that students are learning to answer questions and solve problems, yes, but the education system has picked certain questions that they know how to grade. All the questions have one right answer and a lot of wrong answers. All the problems, math problems, science problems, have one right solution and multiple wrong ones. Then you get out into the world and you're asked questions for which there is no one right answer. So we're thinking of the future now as a branching structure, as a structure which branches out, and that we need to prepare for all of these futures. Is it possible? There's an infinite number? Of course not. But we need to be thinking about contingencies and not being locked into the present, which will be temporary, it will change. Not being locked into that one future that we think is going to happen, but we realize that there are multiple ones out there. Does that solve the problem? I don't really think so. It's not magic. But it gives us some assurance that we're aware of what's going on, and we can be prepared for multiple futures simultaneously. You see these gentlemen sitting over here with the with all the NASA stuff on. University of Houston Clear Lake was actually across the street from the back door of the NASA Johnson Space Center. Saw these kind of guys all the time. And when the astronauts train for a mission, they trained for the space station or the space shuttle or the Apollo program as the machine was built to perform. And they spent most of their time learning how to run the machine. But they also spent some time thinking of what if? Thinking of multiple possible futures. And if they can do that, and military people are doing that, and police officers do that on the street, why are we not doing that in our strategic environment, in our long-term environment, thinking about what if and going on like that? So, the reason that we can do that is that we have three primary mechanisms or drivers, categories of change that create the different futures. The first of these is analogous to physics, momentum. Bodies will remain in a straight line at the same velocity unless acted upon by a force. The same is true of social trends. You draw a line on a spreadsheet, a social trend, it will probably continue for a while in that same direction at that same velocity. But, of course, the kicker is the for a while. One never knows how long that is because what changes the trend, the force, is the direct disruption. It's an event which occurs, and that event changes the trends and could create a whole new system if it's a transformation. Both of those happen to us. Trends keep going, events happen, trends keep going, events happen. In biology, they call that, in evolutionary biology, they call that punctuated equilibrium. It's a new term that actually Darwin, for all of his brilliance, got the actual process, the change process of speciation and species development wrong. He thought it was what's called gradualism. Every generation made a little change, a little change, a little change, a little change. But all he had for data were the species that were existing on the planet at the time he lived. After World War II, we developed the ability to dig out the cores of the ocean, and what did we find? Strata. It goes on for a while, and then boom. And goes on for a while, and then boom. It goes on for a while, and then boom. The most famous boom, of course, was the meteor asteroid, which occurred in 65 million years ago in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Western Hemisphere, which destroyed the atmosphere so much that the dinosaurs basically helped them become extinct, or actually turn into the birds that we have today. So the punctuated equilibrium is the way we think of the future. It's a stutter step process towards the future. We're in an era today. It has its trends, it has its rules, it has its success formulas, and we use those. We don't give up on that. At the same time, we're ready when the disruption occurs to not hang on to it too long and be ready to make the change when the change comes, when the time comes. That's a matter of judgment. And I'll tell you, in school, we're not usually, except you're in your advanced master's or professional school, do you actually get to use judgment. Most of the time, you're using memory and calculation. You're not asked to answer questions that have multiple answers, not asked to solve problems that have multiple solutions exactly like that. So I don't think our schools are really served a purpose. The whole approach to the curriculum is not served a purpose. So each of these three then creates a type of change that we use in this area. The momentum leads to one future. The assumption is that all the trends that we're having, all the assumptions we make, turn out to be true. It rarely happens, but it's a good place to start because it's nice and logical and definitive, and everybody knows how to calculate that. The disruptions then create alternative futures. What if this, and what if that, and now we've got this future, and now we've got this future. Is it possible to catalog all of them? Of course not. There's essentially an infinite number. But we look at the major what-if questions, the major uncertainties, and each one of those creates something else. And then finally, we have our choices, which is based upon our values and our preferences. And out of that, we get a preferred future, which then guides our actions as we action for ourselves, for our families, for our companies, for our communities, and for our countries. We're not talking about any of that at school. We're not talking about the what-ifs in the future. We're not talking about our values in school. And it's tough to do because we have a divisive society, we have lots of different values, we have lots of people upset about lots of things, but still we can't talk about it because we have not been educated and we have not learned how to talk about multiple differences of opinion without considering themselves and others as the enemy, as so totally wrong that it's impossible to even have a conversation. It just has to be a fight. So, multiple futures going forward like that. Each of those three futures has a particular kind of epistemological basis. It comes from a place. The expected future is pure social science. We all learned how to do that. If you had been asked to write a paper about the future in school, you wrote a paper using trends and assumptions and constants, and there you had it, done, paper done, A grade. The alternative futures require some of that, cause-effect contingency thinking, but some imagination. What if this and what if that? It's not pure science fiction. We have something we call weak signals, which are little indications that at the margins, change is beginning to erupt and it's bubbling out there. And one of those changes may come in like that comet did and create a big change in the era. And we pay attention to those. But it's fundamentally a process of imagination and even speculation. Not only are we allowed to do speculation, we have to do speculation. You will never get an alternative future out of logical analysis. It's impossible. You have to leave the pure logic and get into the imaginative space. And finally, we have the preferred future, which is a completely separate foundation of values and preferences and what we prefer to see happen. Again, people will differ. And they'll have meaningful discussions about different values and different sets of ethics and different sets of morals and different sets of preferences and policy and all of that. All should be, definitely. But until we can talk about it and share it and articulate it for ourselves, we're not in a very good position to deal with the future. Finally, then, this is the picture of where it comes from. It's an expanding cone, more possibilities as time goes on. The center of that cone is the expected future. It's not necessarily a straight line, but it is a continuous curve. All the trends just keep going that way. Then out of that, there are plausible futures, which are not probable, but yeah, I can tell a story about that. I think, yeah, I could see that. I don't think it's going to happen, but I can see that it could. Outside of that are the possible futures, those which have more than 0% probability, probably won't happen. But in that region, there's things we call wild cards. Well, COVID-19 was such a wild card, a virus, a little tiny piece of biological material that completely disrupted the planet. That's a wild card. And we have within that, all of those, a region that we prefer. So thinking of the future that way, rather than as a road with a single point of destination, a single point of exit, is freeing. It's liberating to think of it as, well, we're in this interesting situation where we have all these futures. Which one is going to occur is interesting, but trying to figure that out ahead of time is probably a waste of time. I'm going to pause a minute. I've done exactly 30 minutes. Do you believe that? It's right there. Questions, comments? And as my role as the executive director of Teach the Future, I implore you to be thinking about why we're not teaching young people this. Why? I have my reasons, but you should ask yourself that. If you have kids, why aren't they learning this? If you know teachers or know administrators or educators, why are you? Now, a lot of them have never even heard of it, so of course, you can't very well do something. But now that you know it, you might be able to share something with them. And here in Poland and in Warsaw, we could have a thriving community that is educating and bringing young people into this understanding, which gives them flexibility, which gives them adaptability, and gives them the freedom to have a discussion about differences that's not a life and death, not an existential threat. Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm supposed to stop for 15 seconds. The clock will tell me. Questions, comments, objections, complaining?
There is a question.
Yes. Okay, please. I can't see anybody out there because of the lights, so tell me when. Go for it.
Just a short question.
Please.
What constitutes the limit of plausibility?
It's a subjective limit. And the operational definition I give is, could you tell a story? And stories are very important, called scenarios. Could you tell a story about how that scenario, that future occurs? So one could say, posit an event, posit a new technology, posit a new military conflict, posit a new understanding of demography or the appearance of a new medical device, and then you have something else. So, but it's not a calculable limit, and some people have wider limits and consider more things plausible, but that's again the basis of discussion. So it's a good question. There's no clear line of demarcation. The expected from the others is clear. If all the trends happen, that's where you get. After that, it's a gradient out into the limits of plausibility. Thanks for the question. Good. Other questions? Anybody got a mic out there that wants to? Yeah, right here, sir. You just shout it out. I can repeat it if you want. Or, there they go. And now you get your exercise. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Prof, for educating the young ones like us.
Good.
My question is, are we living in the future? Are we currently living in the future?
Yep, we are.
Or are we still wishing for a future that we are going to be living? I'm asking this because it should be seen that the past was some people's future, and it's already fed off.
Yep.
Now, are we in the future, or are we still visioning a future for ourselves to live in? Thank you.
Okay, in brief, we are living in a future, but it is a future of our former selves and former generations. So we are their future. There are futures out there that we will live in for a time, and their children and younger generations will live in for a longer period of time. So the present we consider, without getting too philosophical, is a singular phenomenon. This is a now moment in this time. And everything after this branches out into alternative things that could occur. Those are the futures. We try and make unfortunately, when we use the word futures, everybody thinks of stocks, options, and puts. They've already taken that word over, so we call it the future, but it's always multiple. So I don't know if that speaks to your question, but Gerd said, the future is here. Well, our future from a year ago or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago is here, yes. And a lot has happened, and it's a lot different than it used to be. You could say, yes, the future is here. But technically, we are in a present, which is a singular moment, and the rest after this is multiple futures. Okay? Did that get to you, or you want to ask further?
Yes.
Okay.
But, still, stuffs I want you to chisel out. Now, when we're talking of the future, is it solely something we are predicting that is going to happen, or living the now, which we are talking about? Is it that we are affirming to predestination?
Okay.
Our forefathers or ancestors predicted that the future is going to be bright for their future generations, and here is that future with so many scientific turnarounds and AI and stuff like that. Is that future, or is it a metaphysical future we should be visioning that is transcendental?
Okay. All right. Boy, there's unpacking that. I have to tell you, it's a good thing my undergraduate degree was in philosophy, so I can tell you about the metaphysical reality. First of all, this is a very small point, and Gerd talked about it this morning. We don't make predictions. When somebody asks me, what do you think is going to happen, as you'll see in a moment, I don't answer that question. I give you possibilities. I give you plausible potential outcomes. So we're not predicting anything. And where does the future exist today? In our minds. It doesn't exist out there. Now, some people may transcendentally believe that there's this alternative universe and all that stuff. And everybody says, how can you study something that is the product of a mental construction? Which it is, granted. But you have to point out that the past is a mental construction as well. Now, we have things left over from the past, which we don't from the future, at least as far as we know. People leave things with us, buildings and fossils and documents and photographs. So we have a lot better idea of the past as a subject of study than we do of the future. But again, that's because the phenomenon is different. We use data, we use trends, we use surveys, we use history, historical analogies to imagine alternative future, expected and alternative and preferred futures. But those are mental constructions just like the past is. But we don't have the same kind of data. People haven't dropped future materials on us and said, this is what exists in 100 years. So in that sense, it's all mental. But that's the nature of it. Thank you very much for the questions. Great. Last one. Any last one? Yeah, please, sir. There's another one.
Professor, thank you so much.
Yes.
And I have a question about teaching
Please.
children the future.
Yep.
How do you think how it should look like? Maybe teaching them to ask what-if questions.
Yep.
What to do in some situation, imagining them and searching for the right answers before it happens, actually.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have a whole set of teaching materials, which you can find on teachthefuture.org. So library materials, we have some books, we have teacher activities, we have explanations. It's not as well organized as it might be, but it's a lot of stuff and teachers use it all the time. We will practice asking what-if questions. Not to get the right one, though. And there's another problem of language. We are so dedicated to getting the right answer and arguing our case to get the right answer that it's hard to back up from that and say there are 2 or 3 right answers. But that's in most important questions, there are 2 or 3 I will call plausible answers, valid answers. I mean, we have how many religions in the world? And many religions believe we are the one true and everybody else is wrong. I don't accept that. I think they all have some degree of validity. They have some value to their population, just like one's religion has to oneself. And yet to say they're wrong and I'm right is the source of so much of our conflict these days. I mean, I really feel for the world. I feel for all the people who are being killed today, not just with bullets and bombs, but with malnutrition and with famine and with drought and with floods. we're in a perilous state. And part of it is that we can't come together and talk about it in a sophisticated, intelligent way. We have to beat up on each other. And that, unfortunately, hasn't worked. And if we don't solve that problem, then we will continue to not solve the big problem. So we're not trying to, so we do practice. Notice that what we're teaching students is not the knowledge of what's going to happen in the future. It's how to investigate and how to decide and use judgment, which is a competency. It's not a piece of knowledge. We had a very interesting, there's a school in Turkey that is teaching futures in their high school. Hundreds of students now have gone through that class. When we first took first semester, we asked the students what they thought of the class. And they said, this is great. We like this. We're getting to talk about important things. We're involved. We're engaged. Well, you talk about a crisis of engagement. Go to any high school these days. Students are checked out. I'm not going to do this. Okay, that's a whole other presentation. So they said that we asked the teachers what they thought of it. And they didn't like it. And they're good teachers. They felt like they were not doing their job when the student would say, what do you think is going to happen? And they couldn't answer that. They could answer that in all their other subjects. A science teacher could answer it. A history teacher could answer it. A math teacher could answer it. So when they couldn't teach it by telling them what the answer was, they felt like they were letting them down. The correct answer to that question is, I don't know. But we do have ways of trying to figure out something. We can't know everything about the future, but we can know some things about the future. And we can know what some of the more plausible outcomes are in the future. So one of the meta parts of Teach the Future and of introducing futures thinking is that it doesn't just focus on the future. It requires teachers and students to be talking about competencies and thinking skills and things like that, rather than information and knowledge. I mean, Gerd talked about, the fact that, and he was talking mostly to the students that were here this morning, if you are memorizing facts, then ChatGPT is going to beat you every day of the week. You are not that smart, and you will never get all the knowledge you need. The skills that you would need to have is what to do with that knowledge, and it can tell you some things like that, but it doesn't know how to do that. It can't do that because it doesn't act. All it does is summarize and publish. So learn the things, as he was saying, that the AIs are not doing, may do someday, but right now they can't, we know. That's what your future as a human being is, using these tools but not taking them over. So we're very dedicated to the movement to move away from learning the facts of the textbook, which is still true in almost every high school class in the world and a lot of college classes, rather than let's use a little bit of knowledge and then let's talk about the skills associated with using it, understanding it, interpreting it, making conclusions and judgments about it. That would be a curriculum that I would very much support. So thank you for that. Okay, so they asked me to talk about the future of education, so I'm going to do that here. But I'm already going to tell you what's the future of education. And I gave you the answer to that already. I don't know. But I do know that I listened to a podcast yesterday. What is today? I'm confused now. Maybe it was on Monday. And the person being interviewed wrote a book about AI and its influence on society. And he was asked the question, how do you get started? How do you learn how to use the AIs that are existing today? And his answer was very simple. Use it all the time. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to do this presentation on the future of education. Why don't I see what ChatGPT has to say about that? And full disclosure, so that's why I put ChatGPT on the slide, on the title slide. It's me and the machine telling you what we think is the future of education. So we begin with a concept which is called an era. An era is right out of biological evolution. The Pleistocene was an era. The Cretaceous period was an era. It had a particular character, a certain kind of life, a certain kind of formation and atmosphere. And then the disruption came, whether it was a new biological evolution or whether it was a meteor or whatever, and that changed to another era, another era, another era. We're in an era today, we call it the Anthropocene. It's the era of human we are the disruption ourselves to the planet and creating that. So you've probably heard that before. So these are some of the eras of education when it was apprenticeship, essentially, whether in university you were studying with a tutor or at a farm or in a shop. You were an apprentice. You learned from a single person. Then we had public schools because of the need for education, the Industrial Revolution, and this one believes there will be another era in the future. We'll see that in just a moment. So I asked ChatGPT, tell me what the scenarios are for the future of education, and this is what it came up with. It's a lot of material, so I'll take a moment here while you parse your way through that. List some scenarios for the future of education in the 2030s. Interesting stuff. Would you say that, and I have to admit, I mean, education is my domain. I can talk about the future of energy or the future of trade strategy too, but education is what I do all the time. I couldn't come up with this list. I think it's better than what I would do. But I know what to do with it. I'm not just going to say, okay, thank you very much, there's the future of education, let's leave here. Comments, what do you think? Are there anything on here that you think, we're thinking about the limits of plausibility, anything on here which is not plausible? I think everything is possible. Close to 0% probability, maybe. Anything up here that you see that's, oh no, I couldn't tell a story about that. What do you think? Anybody want to venture a guess? So, are we going to accept this as a set of plausible futures? Okay, that's 10 of them. That's a lot of futures. So when somebody says, what do you think is going to happen? I say, how much time do you have? If you use ChatGPT, you are going to get a lot of plausible futures. Not all of these are going to occur, but we believe that all of them are plausible. I could tell a story about how it comes about. Let me ask you about the list overall. Is there some common characteristic among all of these that it's like? We could call it a bias. If an AI has a bias, I'm no expert on AI biases. Is there a bias here? What don't you see up here? The old, okay. What, tell me. Okay. I'll give you a name for that in a moment. The existing education system, every one of these assumes by 2030 or 2035 a transformation of education. Let me tell you, as a person who's trying to create social change in education, there's a big assumption there that education is going to change at all or in any significant transformational way. When television came along, I'm old enough to remember they said that's going to replace teachers. The computer was going to replace teachers. The internet was going to replace teachers. And education just loped along. There's a famous mental image that we have comparing changes in business and changes in education, using two historical figures, both of whom were very prominent in those fields in the 19-teens, more than 100 years ago. One of those was Thomas Watson. He was the CEO of the IBM Corporation beginning in 1915 and bought that corporation and developed it on into the 1950s, and his son on into the 90s as they went along. Tom Watson showing up in your office today would barely have a concept of what was going on. These things on a desk, what was going on behind it, we think we understand. Electricity, packet switching and all this stuff. He wouldn't even know the names of those things. But John Dewey, a very famous educator around that exact same time, could walk into a classroom in most schools today and know exactly what's going on. There are 20 young people in desks listening to an older person tell them something. Business, military, entertainment, communication has changed enormously. Education has not. Some, but not much. So the bias here is that the future, in other words, item number 0 is not here, no change, or so little change that each one of these is a major transformation. And it's possible that the 11th scenario is what we call continuation. More of the same. That's possible. And this is me commenting on material from ChatGPT and AI because I know the field. What if a young person is given an assignment in school and says, give me some scenarios for the future of education for the 2030s, there's a good chance they wouldn't think that there was something missing there. Let me show you another way of coming up with alternatives. This is called the Gartner Hype Cycle. Some of you know it already. Gartner is a consulting company in the world, and they map technologies on this cycle. And what's the difference here? When the technology gets into the news, that's the definition of hype. That curve goes off the page. And of course, AI is the super hype at the moment. I mean, the social media was it before that. The television was it. All of those were before. And what happens is that the bottom line there, the black line, is what it really is doing, which is so much less than what people are expecting. They said, well, I remember when email came on in the early 80s, and by the middle 80s, everybody said, I don't do email. It's not happening. And then all of a sudden, we were there. So it reaches what's called the peak of expectations, and then it crashes. That was oh so old. That never happened. That's not going to happen. So the Gartner cycle, and they actually have, they put technologies on there. Now, most of these, I don't know what they are. They tend to be in the IT world. They tend to be hardware and software kind of products and whatever. But they actually, for whatever their judgment, this will happen in 2 or 3. But most of them go through this. I would say all of them go through this peak of expectations and then crashing. So there's an alternative future. So some of these could actually occur, but there's going to be a hype, and then there's going to be a crash. That's an alternative future. Other ways of thinking about it as an alternative future. What's the difference between this list and the previous list? It's called reversals. You can't see both of them. If we'd had time, we could have put them on those wonderful 2 screens, but we didn't. The collapse of AI and personalized learning. A national classroom. Sustainability and climate education is not in the core curriculum. Does that have any comparison to the previous one? What did I do to create that list? Just put not in front of everything. The opposite. Are those plausible? So for each one of those 10 potential futures in the future of education, not only could you say we're hyping it and it will go away, at least the expectations will, or it may never occur at all. So now we have 20 alternatives. We have a positive and a negative. So the bias in the first list, these are all wonderfully glorious things. Global classroom and AI and personalized learning and digital citizenship and educational equity. All of these are wonderful things, except that we don't have them today and we may never have them. Thinking in alternatives, not honing in on only one thing. So we have an alternative. We have 2 alternatives for every one on the first list. It'll get hyped and it'll go away, or even the opposite could happen. It may never happen. So where do these things come from? Jim Dater is a famous futurist, founded the program at the University of Hawaii, and he came up, he reviewed his experience, 40 years experience doing scenarios, said there are 4 basic frameworks, 4 basic scenarios. Continuation, that's momentum. If there's no disruption, whatever is true today with certain things changed by degree will essentially be the same era. Continuation. Discipline, meaning that we get up to a point and things are so bad that we really got to lock it down. You all have experienced that. Societies of discipline. That's a scenario. We have science fiction movies about those kind of scenarios. The collapse, limits to growth. Limits to growth expected to collapse. Guess what? It was published in 1973. One of the most best-selling nonfiction books in the history in the 1970s. Its baseline expected is collapse of the economic system in 2025. That's next year. Let's hope they're wrong. But it was interesting. So, decline of the education system because of irrelevance, because of loss of public support, because of any number of reasons, it does become. And then there is finally the transformation, the glorious future, transformation usually positive, and a lot of those things on the first slide could be there. So, how do we get to figure it out? We can't come up with an answer, but we can analyze it. And this is a very famous social psychological theory published literally way back in 1951, and that's way back, okay? Kurt Lewin was a social psychologist, and he said you change attitudes when the forces of change overcome the forces of resistance. Duh, right? Isaac Newton knew that too. So let's apply that to social change. If you want to move a 400-pound rock, you better have 500 pounds of force. If you want to change an institution that is embedded and has inertia, you better have the force to move that thing. And that's one way we look at it. Here's another framework, 3 of these kind of forces called the push of the present, from famous futurist Sohail Inayatullah, the push of the present. These things in the first list are the push of the present. There are people working on those. People working on personalized learning. People working on the global classroom. People working on AI and education. So one of these things could really take off. The pull of the future. The kind of future we really want. We want an education system that's not only valuable and efficient and effective, but cheap and really does and serves the needs of society. That's the pull. And then finally, the weight of the past. The inertia that we've done it this way, and so the forces have to be one way or the other. And finally, another framework we use is the 3 horizons framework. The first horizon is the present, which we believe over time goes away. The third horizon is the visionary future. And the middle horizon is the transitional future between the first horizon and the third horizon. And there are 3 different kinds of people, all of whom are working simultaneously today on those horizons. Managers are trying to maintain the current system. Visionaries are trying to tell us, oh no, there's a much better system out there. We should start working in that direction. And entrepreneurs are those who see the cracks in the current system and move in to take advantage, whether for profit or in my own case, for trying to do some social good. We see an opportunity to do some real reform. We have 2 sources of change in the last slide. 2 sources of change. It comes to us from the world, trends and disruptions, and we play the hand, the choices and the resources that we have. Again, shouldn't we give students, many of whom are anxious about the future, some assurance that they do have some agency? Frankly, I mean, the psychological study says if you act to change the future, you become more optimistic. You feel a little bit better, not to discount the challenges, but you are in the game. You're doing something as opposed to, oh my gosh, I'm a victim. It's all coming around. But at the same time, we can't just say, there's a famous phrase, the best way to predict the future is to create it. Yeah, that's a nice phrase, but the world will also have its way. There are constraints. There are things that we have to take into account. So again, we're looking at a complex system that is interacting both at the world's interactions and the others. Teach the future. That's my own personal preference, and a whole network of people around the world are producing, are trying to move in this direction. That's where we are. Call us, text us, give us, and look in our library and things like that would be great. What is the future of education? I don't know. Let's try and figure it out together, and let's try and work together to make it better than what we have inherited before. It's been a pleasure being with you all. Thank you very much.